April 2nd, 1972. Over Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. The morning sky was supposed to be clear. Instead, it erupted into fire. Lieutenant Colonel ECL Gene Hambleton sat strapped into the right seat of an EB-66C electronic warfare aircraft, codenamed Bat-21. His job was to blind enemy radar, to keep American bombers safe as they pounded North Vietnamese positions below. But on that morning, everything changed in the span of 7 seconds. A shrill tone screamed through Hambleton's headset, the missile warning alarm, that mechanical banshee every aircrew dreaded. He looked down at the scope. A spike of light, then another. North Vietnamese O2 surface-to-air missiles had locked onto them. The pilot yanked the stick, diving hard, the horizon tilting into a whirl of clouds and contrails. Too late. A flash, a roar, the sky disintegrated. The missile struck the EB-66's left wing, tearing the aircraft in half. A wall of flame swallowed the cockpit. G-forces slammed Hambleton against his harness as the jet spiraled downward. Somewhere in the chaos, his hand found the ejection handle. A violent jerk, then silence. He was suddenly weightless, tumbling through smoke and sunlight, the air screaming around him. Below him stretched miles of jungle, a patchwork of green and brown carved by the muddy ribbon of the Cua Viet River. It looked almost peaceful, until he realised it was crawling with enemy troops. The Easter offensive had begun just days earlier. Quang Tri was a battlefield now, swarming with North Vietnamese soldiers advancing south with tanks, artillery and absolute fury. As his parachute snapped open, Hambleton's survival instincts took over. He counted the canopies, 6 other chutes, the rest of the crew. But one by one, fiery trails streaked through the sky. Enemy gunners were firing at the falling men. He saw parachutes collapse, bodies vanish into the trees. Then tracer rounds zipped past his own canopy. He hit the ground hard, rolling through brush and mud. Pain shot up his leg. He was alive, but barely. His radio was intact. His survival pistol was loaded. His training screamed one thing: move. Above him, the sky filled with aircraft, rescue teams, spotter planes, fighters. The jungle trembled with artillery. Within minutes, the airwaves were alive with panic. Commanders realised who had gone down. Not just another airman, not just another call sign. Bat-21 Bravo. Hambleton wasn't a regular flyer. He was one of the Air Force's top electronic warfare officers, a man who knew the locations of radar sites, missile frequencies, even the operating codes for America's most secret countermeasures. If the North Vietnamese captured him alive, everything, every B-52, every strike mission, could be compromised. The most valuable man in Vietnam was now on the ground, behind enemy lines. The order went out immediately: find him at all costs. But Quang Tri was already collapsing. The North Vietnamese Easter Offensive was one of the largest attacks of the entire war. 14 divisions pushing south under a storm of artillery. Villages vanished under shells. Roads were choked with refugees. American advisors and South Vietnamese troops were falling back in chaos. For Hambleton, that chaos became his camouflage. He dragged himself into the undergrowth, burying his parachute, crushing his radio antenna into the soil to muffle the signal. He could hear voices nearby, shouting in Vietnamese. He held his breath, finger trembling on the trigger of his pistol. Above, rescue aircraft circled. One of them was an HH-53 Jolly Green Giant helicopter, lumbering through the smoke with its side door open. It never made it. A burst of anti-aircraft fire tore through its fuselage. It exploded mid-air, raining debris into the jungle. Back at Da Nang, the operations room fell silent. The first rescue attempt was already a failure. In the following hours, the jungle became a furnace. Bombs thundered along the tree line as US aircraft tried to suppress enemy fire. But the North Vietnamese were everywhere, disciplined, relentless, and fully aware of what they had downed. Intercepts soon revealed entire battalions were moving toward the crash site. Hambleton crawled into a hollow near a riverbank, pressing his face into the mud as tanks rumbled past. He stayed there through the night, the mosquitoes thick enough to coat his skin. In the distance, he could hear the low growl of artillery and the distant wail of flares. He thought about his crew, the men who hadn't made it out. The silence of the jungle was broken only by the faint hum of his radio. He whispered his first transmission. Bat-21 Bravo to any station, over. Static, then a voice. Faint, calm, controlled. "We read you, Bat 21 Bravo, stand by." For the first time since the explosion, he felt a sliver of hope. But hope was fragile in that place. The jungle around him was alive with enemy soldiers, and every minute they were getting closer. The men in the air knew it too. They had seen the wreckage, the gunfire, the rising smoke. They knew that Hambleton was deep inside enemy territory, maybe 10 miles north of the front lines, a lifetime away. Rescue teams began forming at dawn. OV-10 Broncos, A-1 Sky Raiders, and heavy lift helicopters. Pilots volunteered faster than command could stop them. Everyone knew the odds, but no one wanted to leave a man like Hambleton behind. The first flights went in that morning. None came back intact. 2 helicopters went down in flames. Then an A-1 Sky Raider vanished into the tree line. Then another. 5 aircraft lost in the first 48 hours. Dozens of men dead or missing. The jungle around Hambleton was littered with the wreckage of the machines sent to save him. Still, he waited, listening to the distant echoes of war, counting the seconds between artillery bursts, whispering into his radio when the static cleared, giving what information he could. The sky above him, once a calm blue ceiling of air superiority, had become a battlefield he could only hear. Every explosion shook the ground like a heartbeat. Every voice over the radio was a lifeline stretching across an invisible gulf between life and death. He was alone, hunted and surrounded. But the Americans were not giving up. Somewhere high above the smoke, a pilot in an observation plane was circling, an OV-10 Bronco with a long-nosed profile and a call sign that would become legend. "Bat 21 Bravo," he said. "This is Bird Dog. We're going to get you home." The voice crackled through the static, steady and unshakable. The race had begun. April 3rd, 1972. The sun rose over Quang Tri province like a curtain lifting on a nightmare. The jungle was still burning from the night before, smoke rising in grey plumes through a tangle of shattered trees and craters. Somewhere in that inferno, Lieutenant Colonel ICL Gene Hambleton was alive, moving inch by inch through enemy territory. Above him, the greatest rescue operation of the Vietnam War was already collapsing into chaos. Every few minutes, the radio crackled with new reports. Downed air crews, shot up choppers, coordinates of wreckage. The command post at Da Nang looked more like a morgue than a control room. Men stared at maps covered in red circles, everyone marking a failed attempt to reach Hambleton. The Air Force called it a search and rescue. But to the men flying into the fire, it felt like suicide. By mid-morning, the rescue effort had turned desperate. 2 HH-53 Jolly Green Giants and 1 HH-3 helicopter had already been torn apart by anti-aircraft guns. Entire ridgelines were bristling with NVA artillery and heavy machine guns. The North Vietnamese weren't shooting at random. They were waiting for the next rescue attempt, calculating altitudes, tracking flight paths, baiting the Americans into their kill zones. Each downed aircraft meant more men stranded in the jungle. Each stranded man triggered another rescue attempt. What began as one downed navigator was turning into a chain of catastrophes. Hambleton could hear some of it from the ground. The explosions, the whining turbines, the distant crashes. The sound of men dying trying to save him. He knew exactly what was happening. He had served long enough to understand the price of a single call sign on a rescue frequency. He whispered into his survival radio, "Bird Dog, this is Bat 21 Bravo. Negative movement, heavy enemy presence. Recommend abort." The voice came back almost instantly, firm, calm, and defiant. "Copy, Bat 21. We're not aborting anything." That voice belonged to Major Bill Bird Dog Henderson, an OV-10 Bronco pilot with the kind of flying style that made commanders nervous and other pilots proud. He was the one keeping Hambleton alive from above, orbiting, relaying, defying. But that morning, even Henderson couldn't change the math. 5 aircraft destroyed, 14 men lost, all within 48 hours. The rescue planners tried everything: smoke screens, diversionary strikes, napalm to clear landing zones. Nothing worked. Every helicopter that crossed the river took fire from the moment it cleared the trees. The NVA were using radar-guided guns, something few American crews had ever faced that far south. It was a slaughter. The message came down from 7th Air Force Force headquarters in Saigon. Suspend rescue operations, no more helicopters, no more losses. But on the ground, that decision meant something else entirely. Hambleton was on his own. As the sky quieted, Hambleton began moving again. He crawled through waist-deep water, using reeds for cover. The jungle was thick with NVA patrols, but he knew how to move. Slow, deliberate, silent. Every step was a calculation. He crossed bomb craters filled with oily rainwater, drank from them, and pushed on. Overhead, Henderson kept his Bronco circling low, almost skimming the treetops. The aircraft wasn't designed for heavy combat, but it was perfect for watching, marking, guiding. He could see flashes of muzzle fire below, hundreds of enemy soldiers sweeping the area. Then came the intercept. American intelligence picked up enemy radio chatter, orders from NVA command. They weren't just searching for a downed pilot, they were searching for a specific man. Capture alive. Priority target. Hambleton's mind replayed what that meant. His knowledge of radar systems, missile frequencies, and jamming protocols could expose entire strike packages. He wasn't just a rescue objective anymore. He was a national security emergency. Commanders realised it too. Intercepted transmissions suggested 2 full battalions were closing in. Nearly 1,000 soldiers converging on the area. The rescue now had a clock ticking louder than the artillery. That afternoon, Henderson made a decision that would define the rest of the mission. If he couldn't bring in helicopters, he would bring in information. He began marking safe paths through the jungle with smoke rockets, calculating every shot with precision. Each white puff in the canopy below told Hambleton where to move, where the NVA weren't. The jungle became a board game of survival, one square at a time. Bat 2-1. Bravo, this is Bird Dog. You're moving toward the fairway. Next green's 200 yards north. To anyone listening, it sounded like nonsense. But the golf course references were coded directions, landmarks from Hambleton's hometown course in Arizona, translated into coordinates on a battlefield. Hole by hole, fairway by fairway, the two men built a secret language only they could understand. For hours, Henderson circled, dodging traces that stitched the air around his plane. He refused to climb higher. Higher meant safety, and losing sight of Hambleton. He wasn't going to let that happen. By dusk, the ground was glowing orange from constant bombardment. American jets pounded the NVA lines, trying to clear a corridor. The jungle looked like it was breathing, each explosion a pulse of light and smoke. Somewhere down there, Hambleton whispered back through static, exhausted but unbroken. Bird Dog, on the green, standing by for next hole. The sun went down. The radio fell quiet. Henderson stayed in the air until his fuel lights blinked red, then reluctantly turned home. When his wheels touched the tarmac at Da Nang, the crew chief could barely see the aircraft's paint under the soot and bullet holes. Inside the operations centre, the mood was grim. Maps were updated, calls logged, missions scrubbed. But nobody could look at the red markers without seeing what they really meant. Friends, call signs, lives. And still, the question hung in the air like the smoke outside the hangars. How much was one man worth? For Bill Henderson, the answer was already decided. He walked out of the briefing tent that night and looked toward the north, toward Quang Tri, where a single voice on a radio still waited. He had been ordered to stand down, but orders meant nothing if they left a man to die. Tomorrow he would take off again, not for glory, not for victory, for a single call sign in the jungle, Bat 21 Bravo, and the hunt would continue. A sky full of wreckage, a jungle full of hunters, and one fragile thread holding back oblivion, a radio whisper that refused to die. By dawn of April 4th, the rescue had bled across maps and mission boards like a spreading ink stain, but the one thing the enemy could not blast from the air was the bond between a circling pilot and a navigator buried in leaves and mud. The connection was thin, brittle, always seconds from vanishing into static. It was also the most dangerous thing in Vietnam that morning, because the North Vietnamese were listening too. The air war over Quang Tri settled into a brutal rhythm. Aircraft rose, aircraft tried, aircraft burned. The rescue helicopters stood down under orders, but the spotter planes did not. High over the haze, call signs orbited at patient speed, carving silent figure eights along the river and the tree lines. Each orbit risked triangulation, each transmission risked a fix. The enemy had wiremen unspooling lines through the brush, antenna masts disguised as saplings, and operators trained to catch a syllable and turn it into a set of coordinates. Radio discipline had to be perfect. Down on the ground, Lieutenant Colonel Isel Gene Hambleton had transformed from aircrew into survival machine. He rationed words the way he rationed breaths, speaking only when the signal felt clean, tightening his sentences until they sounded like code even when they were not. He mapped his world by sound, the thud of artillery miles away like a door slamming in a distant house, the rip of heavy machine guns like cloth tearing, the slow grind of tank tracks chewing wet earth. He knew how close patrols were by the cadence of voices and the crackle of cooking fires. He knew when to freeze by the silence that fell before an ambush, that eerie pause when living jungle turned to stone. Above him, the pilots learned to carry entire conversations without a single normal word. Suggest a direction without saying north or south. Mark a river without calling it a river. Describe a path without naming a road. Hambleton's mind reached for the most American thing he could hide in plain sight. His hometown golf course, a landscape of fairways and greens laid across memory with the precision of a surveyor. The names and yardages from that course became waypoints. A tee box was a starting position. A dogleg was a bend around a grid of huts. A bunker was a bomb crater. A green was a spot to hold, breathe, and wait for the next move. The coded frame did more than fool a listening enemy. It gave the men a shared diagram that lived outside the map and inside the mind. The jungle was a maze. The course was a compass. To anyone intercepting, the words sounded like sports chatter. To those who knew, it was geometry under fire. Move to the next fairway meant shift along the riverbank to the east-facing bank. Stay in the rough meant keep to the scrub on the shaded side of the hedgerow. Lay up short meant stop before the open paddy that would draw small arms fire. The language carried distance, direction, and risk in sentences that sounded harmless. But the risk never left. The enemy adapted. Intercepts tightened. Listening posts crept forward. Each time the airborne orbit tightened to keep reception solid, anti-aircraft gunners tested arcs and altitudes, feeling for the pattern. The pilots changed rhythm. They varied speed, traded orbits, masked their turns in the smoke of strike runs. Everything in the sky became a sleight of hand routine staged with ordnance. Bombs fell where the enemy listened hardest. Flares bloomed where the jungle hid its teeth. The radio stayed just shy of predictable, the way a heartbeat skips before a sprint. Hambleton measured progress not in miles but in sounds growing faint behind him. Machine guns that once felt inside his skull began to echo. Footsteps that once shook the leaves now brushed the edge of hearing. He moved only when the air above was busy, when fighters roared and the forest flinched. He drank from rain pools that tasted of smoke and metal. He learned to let leeches feed until they swelled, then slide them off with a thumb so he would not tear skin. He took sleep in shreds, a minute, then another, then a blink that felt like drowning. There were moments when the radio went dead and the world shrank to insects and breath. In those minutes, the idea of rescue felt like a myth told to children. The weight of secrecy pressed on him. The knowledge in his head, the files he had read, the installations he could sketch with his eyes closed. If captured alive, he would be paraded, interrogated, used. That truth pulled at him as hard as hunger. The code talk across the airways was not just about moving through jungle. It was about keeping a nation's secrets walking on two battered legs. High overhead, the pilot who refused to quit kept weaving his lifeline. The OV-10 Bronco was no armour plate, just a rugged frame, with engines that sounded like saw blades and wings that loved low speed more than altitude. It was the right machine for the wrong mission, and somehow the only machine that fit. Every pass over likely ambush terrain was a dare. Every smoke rocket was a hand extended through a furnace. The pilot flew as if the airfield was a jury and the sky was the testimony. He could not be reckless. He also could not be timid. The difference between those two words was measured in meters and heartbeats. The coded method began to ripple outward. Other aircrews learnt the pattern. Controllers learnt the cadence. The coordination tightened. Strike packages were stacked like scaffolding. High cover to keep enemy fighters at bay. Mid cover to suppress guns. Low cover to watch the ground. The Bronco and its kind threading the layers. The jungle below was never quiet again. It burned by afternoon and smouldered by night. The heat rose in waves that made wings shimmer and optics lie. Through that distortion, a single figure crawled, paused, listened, and continued. Every successful move fed the paradox at the mission's heart. The longer the navigator survived, the more attention the enemy devoted to caging him. They poured men into the search, set ambushes on likely routes, mined footpaths that scouts might use. The rescue became a chess problem with no clean solution. Sacrifice the quiet to gain speed. Sacrifice speed to keep radio time short. Sacrifice daylight for darkness, and discover that the jungle at night is a cathedral of mistaken shapes where one wrong breath summons a patrol. Still, the thread held. The code carried. The orbit persisted. Between bursts of static and thunder, the map of a golf course rolled like a scroll over a battlefield half a world away. Fairways cut through tree lines. Greens appeared where there were only pools and reeds. Bunkers replaced bomb craters. The translation was imperfect and somehow perfect enough. By the time the second night faded, the voice in the jungle had become something larger than a call sign. It was proof that a man could be hunted by battalions and still navigate by memory, that a pilot could deflect death with bearings disguised as leisure, that an entire air war could pause its own collapse to move a single human being a few hundred yards closer to a line on a map. The jungle did not care. The enemy did not care. But the system of men and machines above the canopy cared with a stubbornness that rewrote tactics hourly. In the end, the code was more than secrecy. It was faith given shape. A childhood course turned into a lifeline. A private language turned into a shield. A whisper turned into direction. And the whisper endured. By April 5th, 1972, the rescue of Bat 21 Bravo had officially been declared impossible. The jungle was a furnace, the air was a killing zone, and headquarters had made its decision. No more losses, no more heroics. Orders were transmitted through the usual channels, polished with the bureaucratic calm of men far from the sound of gunfire. The mission was suspended indefinitely, but there was one pilot who never got the message. Or if he did, he decided it didn't apply to him. Major Bill Bird Dog Henderson, the man in the little OV-10 Bronco, was already rolling down the runway before dawn, his engines growling like chainsaws through the haze. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to fly at all. But Henderson was the kind of man who measured orders by their proximity to conscience, and his conscience was flying straight toward the voice still whispering in the jungle. To the ground crews, it looked like routine reconnaissance. To Henderson, it was mutiny with a flight plan. The OV-10 was never meant for rescue work. It was a light observation aircraft, twin-engine, bubble cockpit, thin skin. It could loiter low and slow, mark targets, and call in strikes. It could also die quickly if anyone shot at it, and everyone in Quangtree was shooting at something. But Henderson knew its strength. It could fly under radar, skim riverbeds, and slip between tree lines. It was the perfect aircraft for a man who intended to bend every rule of engagement in the book. He kept his altitude low, under 200 feet, tracing the snaking curve of the river like a bloodhound. The jungle below looked calm. Too calm. Every shadow could hide a muzzle. Every clearing could host a gun. He watched for glints of metal in the brush, for the white flash of a missile exhaust, for the sudden spark that meant death was on the way. When he reached the coordinates where Hambleton's last signal had originated, he throttled back and keyed his mic. Bat 21 Bravo, this is Bird Dog. You still with me? Static. Then a whisper so faint he thought it might be imagination. Still here, Bird Dog. Moving toward the fairway. That voice was all Henderson needed. He began circling tight, carving loops so narrow his own contrails crossed. The anti-aircraft fire started immediately, green and red traces climbing from the tree line like fireworks from hell. Henderson rolled the Bronco sideways, skimming over the treetops, his cockpit filling with the smell of smoke and cordite. The NVA gunners had learned to aim high, expecting American planes to stay at safe altitudes. Henderson refused to be predictable. He danced just above the canopy, the sound of his engines echoing through the valley like a dare. Each time the traces stopped, he'd drop a smoke rocket, white for safe, red for danger, yellow for hold. Hambleton watched the distant puffs of colour and adjusted his course, inching from one patch of cover to another. It was a rescue choreographed by instinct and insanity. At Da Nang, when Henderson's transmissions were logged, the operations controller nearly choked on his coffee. The mission had been scrubbed, but Henderson was in the air anyway, talking to the target. The radio erupted with confusion. Senior officers shouting for him to break off, to return immediately, to stand down. Henderson ignored them all. "Can't copy, too much static," he replied, his favourite lie. He knew what they didn't. Hambleton's signal was fading, batteries dying. If he went silent now, they might never find him again. The enemy was already tightening the net. Henderson's defiance wasn't about disobedience anymore. It was about time. Hour after hour, the Bronco stayed overhead, marking, guiding, dodging fire. Henderson's voice became Hambleton's compass, his presence a promise. "Bat 21 Bravo, you're near the rough. Stay low, crawl north to the next tee." "Copy that, bird dog. Fairway ahead." The coded golf course dialogue continued like a heartbeat. Each phrase disguised coordinates, each exchange threaded through chaos. The NVA tried jamming frequencies, broadcasting fake transmissions to lure Hambleton into traps. Henderson countered by switching channels in rapid sequence, sometimes mid-sentence, forcing the enemy to chase him across the spectrum. By nightfall, the jungle was glowing red from artillery and napalm. Henderson finally returned to base with his fuel almost gone, his aircraft stitched with bullet holes, his uniform soaked in sweat. He climbed down from the cockpit, silent, face streaked with grime. The maintenance crew counted 11 hits on the fuselage, 1 on the tail boom, and a fragment lodged in the canopy frame, a few inches from his head. Command tried to ground him. They cited regulations, chain of command, risk protocols. Henderson nodded, signed the forms, and took off again at dawn. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical, obsessed with precision. He studied enemy fire patterns, learned when they reloaded, when they ate, when they rested. He timed his passes for those moments. He knew which tree lines hid the radar trucks and which stretches of the river offered cover. Each flight turned the jungle into a map of lessons written in smoke and blood. Other pilots began following his lead. The official rescue was dead, but the unofficial one was alive and multiplying. Spotter planes, forward air controllers, even a few gunships began coordinating around Henderson's improvised system. They called it Operation Bird Dog. When he wasn't flying, he was in the ops tent, hunched over radio transcripts, translating Hambleton's coded messages back into coordinates. His notes looked like madness, scribbles of golf holes and distances mixed with topographic markers. But each detail mattered. A sand trap meant a paddy field. A green meant a clearing. The clubhouse meant the river crossing where they might extract. Through it all, Henderson never met Hambleton. He had never even seen his face. But the man in the jungle had become his responsibility, his ghost, his mirror. When other pilots asked why he kept risking his life for one man, his answer was always the same: because he's still out there talking. For Henderson, silence was death. As long as Hambleton's voice came through the static, he would fly. In those days, the war had boiled down to a single thread of radio code and the defiance of one pilot who refused to let that thread snap. Higher command called it insubordination. History would call it something else entirely: loyalty. As the sun set over the burning horizon, Henderson made one more low pass over the jungle, dropping a single white smoke rocket near the riverbank. A sign, a promise, a signal that tomorrow, no matter what the orders said, Bird Dog would return. And somewhere beneath the canopy, the voice of Bat 21 Bravo whispered back through the static: "Roger, Bird Dog. I'll be waiting on the next hole." April 6th, 1972. The air over Quang Tri hung heavy with smoke and disbelief. The rescue of Bat 21 Bravo had become more than a mission. It was a wound that refused to close. Each attempt to save one man had drawn blood from dozens more. The sky that once belonged to American air power was now a graveyard of twisted metal and burnt wings. At Da Nang, the operations tent had gone quiet. Maps no longer looked like tools, they looked like obituaries. Every red circle marking a crash site, every black line marking a flight path that never came home. The numbers told their own story. Helicopters downed, pilots lost, para-rescuemen missing. The arithmetic of heroism had turned into the geometry of grief. Major Bill Bird Dog Henderson knew every name on that board. He had flown alongside some of them. He had watched their call signs go silent. But each time someone asked if it was worth it, if saving one man justified all the others who had died, Henderson refused to answer. Not because he didn't know the truth, but because the truth didn't matter anymore. He wasn't flying for the math, he was flying for the promise. On the ground, Hambleton was learning the same lesson from the other side of the radio. He could hear the war expanding around him, the artillery coming closer, the jets screaming overhead. Sometimes he heard crashes, the final thud of a helicopter hitting the jungle floor. He knew they were trying to reach him, and he knew that, because of him, men were dying. He whispered once into the static, his voice trembling, "Bird dog, tell them to stop." "It's not worth it." Henderson's reply was steady, almost cold. "Bat 21 Bravo, we don't leave our own." "Copy." There was no more discussion. The cost grew by the hour. Pararescue teams inserted by helicopter were cut down in minutes. An entire crew of a Jolly Green Giant went missing after taking a hit on final approach. A South Vietnamese rescue attempt ended in disaster when their chopper exploded mid-air. Each failure drew more fire, more losses, more silence. By the third day, the rescue effort had become a moral argument as much as a military one. Commanders debated in air-conditioned rooms hundreds of miles away how many lives justify one. How do you measure duty against consequence? The answers came wrapped in doctrine, protocol, and caution. But none of that reached the men still flying over the jungle. They were too close to the noise to think philosophically. Henderson's defiance had inspired others. One Sky Raider pilots from the Sandy units volunteered for runs over the target area, using their prop-driven aircraft to draw fire and locate hidden gun positions. Each sortie meant minutes of survival time for Hambleton, but each sortie also came with a price. The Sky Raiders were slow, vulnerable, perfect targets for radar-guided flak. 2 went down in flames that week, 1 pilot ejected into the river. Henderson heard his mayday call, short, sharp, then cut off by gunfire. The jungle claimed him before the rescue teams even lifted off. Another pilot crash-landed just 2 miles south of Hambleton's position, but the terrain was so dense no one could reach him. His beacon transmitted for 12 hours, then went silent. When Henderson landed that night, his face was grey from exhaustion. He had flown 3 sorties, each under withering fire. The crew counted 23 bullet holes in his Bronco. He refused to talk about them. Inside the tent, a young lieutenant read the casualty list aloud. Henderson didn't look up until the names reached one he recognised. Captain William Buddy Walker, one of his closest friends. Walker had been hit while trying to guide a rescue helicopter through the smoke. His last words over the radio were, "Keep it steady, I see him." Then static. The silence after that moment became a sound of its own. That night, Henderson sat on the wing of his aircraft long after the mechanics had gone. The jungle was a black smear on the horizon, its edges lit by flashes of distant bombardment. He lit a cigarette and stared into the dark, thinking about the men whose voices he'd never hear again. Then he thought about the one voice still out there, still whispering back through the noise, refusing to die. "Bat 21 Bravo, this is Bird Dog. You copy?" A pause. Static. Then, faint, almost unreal, the reply. "Copy, Bird Dog. Still on the course, the line held." Back in the jungle, Hambleton's world had shrunk to inches. Every movement was pain. He crawled on elbows and knees, dragging his survival radio and a small map scribbled with coded notes. He had stopped counting hours. The days bled together in a haze of mud, hunger, and fear. Once, while crossing a stream, he froze as a column of NVA soldiers passed so close he could smell the sweat on their uniforms. He pressed his face into the water until they were gone. When he surfaced, he realised he was crying without sound. At command centres across Vietnam, officers kept asking the same question. How much longer could one man survive out there? The answer was different depending on who you asked. The engineers said 72 hours. The medics said maybe 96. Henderson said, "As long as we keep talking to him." But the losses kept coming. Another helicopter destroyed, another crew gone, another family waiting for a letter that would start with, "The United States Air Force regrets to inform you." The arguments grew sharper. Was Hambleton's knowledge worth the sacrifice? His clearance level was higher than most generals. If captured, he could expose radar frequencies, missile codes, countermeasures. The Pentagon had quietly concluded that losing him alive might be worse than losing him dead. And yet every pilot who flew that route ignored the calculus. They weren't rescuing a security asset, they were rescuing a man. By the end of the week, the jungle around Hambleton was littered with wreckage. Broken helicopters, burned fuselages, scattered helmets, torn flight suits. The river was slick with oil. The smell of smoke and rot hung thick in the air. Even the birds had fled. Henderson circled above it all, the lone witness to a tragedy that kept repeating itself. When he spoke into the radio now, his voice carried the weight of the dead. Bat 21 Bravo, we're still here. Keep moving. Don't stop. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then came the answer, steady but weaker than before. Copy, Bird Dog. See you on the next hole. It was a conversation carried on the bones of men who would never speak again. In the days to come, the cost would only rise. But in that moment, that quiet exchange between a man in the sky and a man in the mud, the war paused. The noise, the losses, the politics, the grief, all of it fell away, leaving only the echo of loyalty. The human cost was staggering, but for the men who lived it, cost was a concept that belonged to accountants and historians. Out there, in the fire and the smoke, the only equation that mattered was unfinished. Because Bat 21 Bravo was still alive, and Bird Dog wasn't done flying. April 7th, 1972. The jungle was no longer green. It was black and grey, a landscape of ash, blood and ghosts. The air was thick with humidity and the iron scent of shrapnel. The earth itself felt hostile, vibrating with the distant tremor of artillery. Somewhere within that inferno, Lieutenant Colonel ICL Gene Hambleton was still moving, inch by inch, mile by mile, dragging a radio, a pistol, and the last flicker of his strength through the heart of enemy territory. He was no longer a man on the run. He was a shadow crawling through the wreckage of a dying war. For 11 days, Hambleton had survived on what the jungle gave him, muddy water, roots, and the occasional handful of leaves. His uniform was shredded. His face was a mask of grime and exhaustion. Mosquitoes swarmed his open wounds. Leeches clung to his legs like black ribbons. He had lost count of how many times he had thrown up after drinking from bomb craters filled with chemical runoff. His compass was gone. His map was destroyed. But he still had Bird Dog. High above, Major Bill Henderson was flying patterns so low that tree branches grazed his wingtips. Every time the radio hissed, he expected to hear nothing, just static, just silence. But then, faint and broken, came the whisper, "Bird Dog, this is Bat 21 Bravo, still crawling." Those words were a lifeline. Henderson circled again, his voice calm, methodical, almost surgical. "Roger that, Bat 21. From the tee box, you'll want to stay short of the green. Follow the fairway till you see the water hazard. Keep to the rough." To the untrained ear, it sounded like nonsense. To Hambleton, it was survival encoded in the language of home. The golf course in Tucson had become his map to freedom, each hole a reference point, each fairway a bearing toward the south. Stay short of the green meant avoid the open paddy. Water hazard meant the Cua Viet River. Rough meant cover thick enough to hide him from patrols. He moved at night, when the jungle turned black and soundless. The moonlight barely reached the ground through the canopy. He used the dim glow of distant flares to judge direction. When the artillery fire stopped, he froze. Silence meant movement. Enemy patrols sweeping with flashlights and bayonets. Sometimes they passed close enough for him to smell the tobacco on their breath. He pressed himself into the mud, face down, praying the leeches wouldn't twitch. Once he stumbled upon the wreck of a downed helicopter, twisted metal jutting from a crater, the smell of jet fuel thick and sickening. Inside, the bodies of 3 airmen, burned beyond recognition. He pulled a poncho liner from one of them, whispered a prayer, and kept crawling. Above him, the air war never stopped. Henderson coordinated with strike aircraft to pound the jungle around Hambleton's path, turning potential ambush zones into scorched earth. It was a brutal paradox. The bombs that could kill him were also the only thing keeping him alive. The Americans were carving a corridor of destruction just wide enough for one man to crawl through. Every night, the horizon glowed orange. Trees toppled like matchsticks. The roar of explosions rolled through the valleys, echoing off the mountains. It was as if the entire jungle was burning just to keep one man breathing. On the 8th day, Hambleton's radio died. The silence was instant, absolute, suffocating. He tapped the transmitter, shook it, checked the battery compartment. Nothing. The line that had tethered him to the world, to Bird Dog, to hope, was gone. He sat there in the mud, staring at the black box in his hands. For a moment, he considered ending it. One bullet would stop the pain, stop the crawling, stop the endless fear. But then, from somewhere deep inside, the same stubbornness that had carried him through 20 years of combat whispered a single word: move. He crawled. Without guidance, every decision was a gamble. He crossed rivers by floating on debris, clutching branches as current pulled at his limbs. He hid in hollowed logs during daylight, breathing through the smallest cracks. He learned to tell direction from the wind and the rhythm of artillery. Each step south was a miracle. Back at Da Nang, when Henderson realised Hambleton's radio had gone silent, he didn't wait for permission. He flew out again, ignoring every order to stand down. He flew lower, slower, tracing smoke trails and searching for any sign. He marked likely routes with coloured flares, hoping Hambleton would see them from the ground. He dropped survival kits, each one packed with water, rations and batteries. One of those kits landed within 20 yards of Hambleton. He opened it with shaking hands and burst into tears. Inside, a chocolate bar, a can of peaches and a new radio battery. When he powered the radio back on, the first voice he heard was Bird Dog. "Bat 2-1 Bravo, this is Bird Dog. You copy?" "Copy, Bird Dog," Hambleton rasped. "Still in the rough." Henderson laughed, the sound half relief, half disbelief. "That's a hell of a long hole, Bat 2-1. "Yeah," Hambleton replied weakly, "but I'm still playing." That night, a new kind of mission began. Operation Ivory Coast South, a covert crawl directed entirely by voice and faith. Henderson and his fellow pilots flew non-stop, guiding Hambleton through coded instructions, keeping him moving toward the river where a small South Vietnamese SEAL team waited for extraction. The SEALs called themselves Lima Site 7. They were volunteers, men who had spent years fighting in the Delta, specialists in moving unseen through hostile territory. Their task: reach Hambleton, get him to the river, and bring him home. For 3 nights, they crept through the jungle parallel to his path, using the same coded language passed down through Henderson. They never saw Hambleton until the 4th night, when one of them spotted movement, a filthy, skeletal figure dragging himself through a patch of reeds. "Bat 2-1 Bravo," the SEAL whispered. "We've got you." Hambleton looked up, eyes glassy, uncomprehending. Then he broke down, his body collapsing from exhaustion. The SEALs carried him the last mile on a makeshift litter, weaving through burning brush and enemy patrols. Above them, Henderson's Bronco traced circles in the smoke, marking the extraction zone with flares. The radio chatter was a blur, gunfire, call signs, chaos. When the SEALs reached the river, they inflated a rubber boat and pushed off just as searchlights swept the banks. Tracer rounds followed them across the water. Bullets ripped through the night, hitting the surface like raindrops. One SEAL was wounded. Another fell overboard but climbed back in. Henderson called for cover fire, and American jets answered. The river erupted in flames as napalm canisters detonated along the shoreline. When the boat finally reached the far bank, Hambleton was unconscious, but he was alive. The rescue had taken 11 days. It had cost the lives of 14 Americans and destroyed 11 aircraft. And yet, when the news reached the airbase, men wept openly. Henderson landed his Bronco, climbed out, and walked straight to the medevac tent. Hambleton lay there under a blanket, barely recognisable. His lips were cracked, his skin blistered, his body trembling from dehydration. But when he opened his eyes and saw Henderson standing there, he managed a weak salute. "Bird Dog," he whispered. "You made it." Henderson smiled. "No, sir." "You did outside. The jungle still burned. The war still raged. But for one night, in that corner of Vietnam, defiance had triumphed over death. The long crawl to freedom was over, and the man who refused to quit had kept his promise." April 13th, 1972. 11 days since Bat 21 Bravo fell from the sky. 11 days of blood, smoke, and stubborn faith. The official record would later call it a covert recovery under adverse conditions. The men who lived it called it something simpler: hell. When dawn broke over Quang Tri, the landscape looked like the aftermath of the apocalypse. The jungle was burned down to its bones, craters filled with stagnant water. Trees stood naked and black, their trunks wrapped in smoke like ghosts refusing to leave. The river, the Cua Viet, shimmered with oil and ash. On the far bank, enemy patrols moved methodically, their rifles glinting under the first grey light. And in that wasteland, the rescue that wasn't supposed to happen was finally underway. The command in Saigon had made its stance clear. No more losses, no more missions. The cost had become unbearable. 11 aircraft destroyed, 14 Americans dead, dozens wounded. But Major Bill Bird Dog Henderson wasn't listening. Orders were for men who could sleep at night. He hadn't slept in days. In a dimly lit briefing tent, Henderson traced his finger along the map, from the last confirmed position of Bat 21 Bravo to the bend in the river where South Vietnamese SEALS were waiting. The route was madness. The terrain was mined, occupied and crawling with NVA patrols. The river was patrolled by gunboats. The odds of survival were almost zero. Almost was good enough. He called in favours, bent protocols and assembled a small, mixed team of US advisors and South Vietnamese commandos, the Lima Site 7 unit. They would go in under the cover of night, moving upriver by boat, reach Hambleton and pull him out. No helicopters, no heavy air support, just silence, darkness and precision. The operation began just before midnight. Henderson stayed in the air, his OV-10 Bronco circling low over the extraction zone. His job was to guide the SEALs using coded radio bursts. 1 blink for north, 2 for south, 3 for stop. To anyone intercepting, it was meaningless noise. To the men below, it was life or death. The river swallowed the sound of their paddles as the SEALS drifted through the fog. Their blackened faces disappeared into the reflection of burning trees. Every few minutes they froze, listening. A splash upstream, a cough in the reeds, the faint clank of metal that could mean an oar or a rifle. Hambleton lay half-conscious near the waterline, wrapped in reeds and mud. He'd heard the boats before he saw them, soft ripples breaking the stillness. When a hand touched his shoulder, he almost fired, but then he heard a whisper, "Bat 21 Bravo, friendly." They lifted him gently, their movements practiced and wordless. He was too weak to stand, barely strong enough to breathe. They strapped him into the bottom of the boat, covered him with vegetation, and pushed off. Up above, Henderson saw them emerge from the tree line, tiny shadows against the burning horizon. He keyed his mic. "Lima 7 Bird Dog, I have visual. You're clear for 200 yards. Make it count." That's when the first flare went up. Enemy patrols on the far bank had seen movement. Searchlights cut across the river like blades. Machine guns opened fire, tracers stitching the water. The SEALs ducked low, paddling furiously. Bullets snapped through the air. One man was hit in the shoulder but kept rowing. Another fell overboard and didn't resurface. Henderson called for support. "Any aircraft, this is Bird Dog. Fire mission on my mark. North Bank, coordinates 043 by 079. Within seconds, the night exploded. F-4 Phantoms swooped in, dropping ordnance so close that shockwaves rippled across the river. Napalm burned the shoreline, painting the water in liquid fire. The SEALS rode straight through the smoke, their boat rocking violently as explosions tore through the jungle. "Bat 21 Bravo," Henderson shouted over the radio. "You hang in there." "We've got you." Hambleton could barely hear him. The world was a blur of flame and thunder. His vision flickered. Sky, water, sky again. Then silence. The boat reached the southern bank. The survivors dragged Hambleton into the reeds, collapsing beside him. Henderson circled overhead, searching for confirmation. His eyes found the signal. A single red flare rising weakly through the smoke. It was over. The next day, an Air America helicopter landed on a remote patch of scrubland 20 miles south of the river. Henderson was waiting when they brought Hambleton out on a stretcher. The navigator's skin was grey, his frame skeletal, but his eyes were alive. He tried to speak, but couldn't. Henderson knelt beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You made it home, Gene. You made it." For a long time, neither man said anything. The noise of engines and rotors faded into the background. Around them stood the men who had made the impossible possible, pilots, SEALS, and air crews who had defied every regulation in the book because loyalty mattered more than logic. Later, when Hambleton was stabilised aboard a medevac flight, Henderson was summoned by command. There would be inquiries, there would be paperwork, there might even be reprimands. But when he stepped into the debriefing room, the officers fell silent. The man they had ordered him to abandon was alive. There was nothing left to say. That evening, Henderson finally slept for the first time in almost 2 weeks. He dreamed of radio static and the sound of water hitting the hull of a small rubber boat. In the days that followed, word of the rescue spread quietly through the ranks. Official communiques avoided names. Reports used coded phrases like extraction successful and target secured. But every pilot in Vietnam knew the story. They called it the Bat-21 Rescue, the mission that rewrote the boundaries of duty and defiance. For the men who lived it, the memory was sharper than any medal. Henderson would later say he didn't think of it as heroism. "I just couldn't leave him," he said simply, not while he was still talking. When Hambleton finally woke in a hospital bed in Da Nang, his first words were a rasped whisper. "Did Bird Dog make it?" The nurse smiled. "Yes, sir. He's fine." His right outside Hambleton closed his eyes and let out a long breath. Not of relief, but of gratitude. The kind of gratitude that lives somewhere deeper than words, born of nights where survival feels like theft. Hours later, Henderson stepped into the room. The two men locked eyes. No handshake, no speeches, just a salute, one survivor to another. Outside, the war thundered on. But for that moment, in that small hospital room lit by the glow of morning, the noise of Vietnam faded into silence. The forbidden rescue was over. The man who disobeyed orders had brought his brother home. And for one rare fleeting instant, the chaos of war made sense. When the smoke finally cleared over Quang Tri, the jungle returned to silence. The guns fell quiet, the fires burned out, and the sky, that same sky that had turned into fire 11 days before, was once again empty. For most of Vietnam, the war rolled on as it always had, in chaos, in confusion, and in the quiet arithmetic of casualties. But for the men who had flown, crawled, and died for one man, Bat-21 Bravo, something fundamental had changed. The mission was over, but its shadow stretched far beyond the borders of Vietnam. Lieutenant Colonel ISIL Gene Hambleton had survived the impossible. He was airlifted to Da Nang, gaunt and nearly unrecognisable. His body weight had dropped to a fraction of what it was when he had taken off from Corot 11 days earlier. His skin was blistered, his hair matted with mud and blood, his hands raw from crawling. Yet his mind was sharp, too sharp. The doctors said he muttered in code even in his sleep, whispering distances, bearings and golf holes, as if still navigating that endless green course through the jungle. He never forgot it. None of them did. Major Bill Bird Dog Henderson was called into headquarters 3 days after the extraction. The men waiting for him weren't some pilots. They were senior officers, the kind who spoke softly and carried thick folders. Henderson expected a reprimand. He got silence instead. The ranking general stared at him for a long time, then said only one thing. "You disobeyed a direct order." Henderson didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." The general nodded once, closed the folder and said, "Good work." Then he stood up and left the room. That was the end of it. The military never punished Henderson. It couldn't. The public would never hear the full story, not yet, but every man in uniform knew. In the mess halls, in the flight lines, in the shadowed corners of the officer clubs, the story passed from one pilot to another like a whispered prayer. Bird Dog didn't leave his man. The numbers were staggering. 11 aircraft destroyed, 14 Americans dead, countless wounded, dozens of sorties flown under impossible odds, all for one navigator, and yet, for the first time in that brutal war, no one asked whether it had been worth it. Because the Bat-21 mission wasn't about strategy or politics. It was about something far older, carved into the bones of every soldier who ever swore an oath, the belief that no one gets left behind. In the aftermath, both the US Air Force and Navy quietly rewrote their rescue doctrines. Search and rescue, once a matter of procedure, became a matter of principle. The lessons of Quang Tri would define how every downed airman was recovered for decades to come. Smaller teams, covert extraction, ground coordination with aerial control. Every rescue plan that followed, from Grenada to Iraq to Afghanistan, carried traces of Bat-21. But the men who lived it didn't speak about it easily. Hambleton recovered slowly. He returned to the States, thinner, quieter, and haunted. The press wanted interviews, but he declined most of them. When he finally spoke, years later, he said only this: "I survived because men disobeyed orders to save me. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that." He retired from the Air Force not long after and lived quietly in Tucson, Arizona, the same city where his coded golf course still existed, hole for hole, fairway for fairway. He would sometimes visit it in the early mornings, walking alone with a club in his hand, tracing the same course that had once guided him through hell. People who saw him never realized that every stroke, every hole, every green carried the weight of memory. A map of survival burned into his soul. Henderson stayed in the service a few more years. He never liked the word hero. He said it didn't belong to men like him, only to the ones who didn't come home. When asked about the mission, his answer was always the same. It wasn't a rescue. It was a promise kept. He kept flying until his body told him to stop. Even in retirement, when he spoke to young pilots, he never mentioned his medals. He mentioned the names of the men who hadn't made it. The para-rescuemen, the Sky Raider pilots, the chopper crews who had gone down one after another, each believing they might be the one to make it through. Their sacrifice became part of Air Force tradition, carved into the silent ethos of rescue wings, that others may live. The story of Bat 21 spread through the ranks long before Hollywood discovered it. In hangars and briefings, it was told not as legend, but as a warning of the price loyalty demands and the thin line between courage and madness. Every man who flew rescue missions after 1972 knew that line, and they knew that crossing it sometimes meant salvation. For the families of the dead, the war never truly ended. The letters came, the medals followed, and the explanations always felt too small. But among them was a quiet understanding that their husbands, sons, and brothers had not died in vain. They had died for a man they had never met, because that was what their code demanded. When Hambleton passed away decades later, at the age of 85, his obituary barely mentioned the war. It simply read, Lieutenant Colonel Iseal E. Hambleton, U.S. Air Force retired, survived Vietnam. Known to friends as Bat 21 Bravo. At his funeral, an aging pilot in civilian clothes stood in the back, head bowed, hands clasped. When the ceremony ended, he walked to the grave, placed a small bronze golf ball marker on the headstone, and whispered, "Fairways clear, Gene." Then he walked away without another word. History recorded Bat 21 as one of the costliest rescues of the Vietnam War, a mission that tested every limit of discipline, loyalty, and command. But to the men who lived it, it was simpler than history books ever made it. It was about faith, not in victory, not in policy, but in each other. In the end, Bat 21 became a mirror for the entire war, a conflict defined not just by loss, but by what men were willing to risk for one another. The jungle where Hambleton had crawled is quiet now. The river has changed its course. The craters are filled with water and reeds. Nature has reclaimed the scars. But sometimes, in the silence after rain, villagers say they still hear faint echoes from the sky, a voice calling through static and another answering back. Bat 21 Bravo, this is Bird Dog, you copy? A pause, then softly. Still here, Bird Dog, still playing through.